The winter of 1944 descended upon the Ardennes forest with a deceptive quiet, cloaking the landscape in a shroud of bitter cold and persistent fog. For the American soldiers of the U.S. First Army holding this sector of the Western Front, it was a time of weary anticipation. The war, they believed, was in its final stages. The Third Reich was cornered, battered from the east by the relentless Soviet advance and from the west by the Allied forces that had swept across France since the Normandy landings. This quiet, rugged terrain of hills and dense woods was considered a ghost front, a place for new divisions to get their first taste of combat or for exhausted units to rest and refit. As December settled in, the GIs prepared for a cold but peaceful Christmas, their thoughts drifting homeward, convinced that the German war machine was broken and capable only of a desperate defense. They were blissfully unaware that on the other side of the Siegfried Line, the most significant German offensive in the West since 1940 was about to be unleashed upon them. This impending storm was the brainchild of one man, Adolf Hitler. From the cavernous depths of his Wolf's Lair headquarters, the Führer was planning a final, monumental gamble. With the Reich crumbling, he envisioned a single, decisive blow that could dramatically alter the course of the war. His plan was audacious in its scope, aiming for nothing less than a repeat of his greatest triumph. Hitler personally insisted on the offensive, seeking to replicate the stunning success of 1940, when German panzer divisions had burst through these same forests, outflanked the Maginot Line, and raced to the English Channel, forcing the capitulation of France. He believed that the element of surprise, combined with overwhelming force concentrated on a weak point, could once again shatter the Allied front. The objective was the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. By capturing the city, Hitler intended to sever the primary supply line for the Allied armies in the north and split the British and American forces, creating a political crisis that he believed would fracture their alliance and force them to sue for peace. While Hitler was consumed by this grandiose vision, his most seasoned commanders viewed the plan with thinly veiled horror. For the professional generals of the Wehrmacht, the Führer's ambitions bordered on delusional. They saw the grim reality: Germany lacked the fuel, the munitions, and the seasoned troops to sustain such a massive offensive. Men like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model, tasked with executing the operation, considered the plan utterly suicidal. They argued for a more limited, realistic objective, but their protests were dismissed. Hitler's will was absolute. In an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion following the July 20 assassination attempt, dissent was not tolerated. To ensure absolute secrecy, the officers involved in the planning were forced to sign non-disclosure oaths, binding them to silence under the direct threat of the death penalty for any breach. This desperate operation was not merely a military strategy, it was an article of faith dictated by a leader who refused to accept the reality of impending defeat. It was a last throw of the dice, a final, desperate attempt to seize victory from the jaws of a war that was already lost. The German generals prepared to obey, convinced they were leading their last reserves into a meticulously planned catastrophe. The very possibility of the Ardennes offensive hinged on a single, non-negotiable condition: absolute, total surprise. For an army that Allied intelligence believed to be on the verge of collapse, the feat of assembling 3 field armies, complete with over 1,000 tanks and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, without alerting the enemy was a monumental challenge. The success of this concealment would become one of the most stunning intelligence failures of the entire war, a masterclass in military deception executed under the most desperate of circumstances. The entire operation was given the deliberately defensive and mundane codename, Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. A piece of misdirection designed to suggest a purely reactionary posture aimed at defending Germany's borders. The German High Command orchestrated the buildup with meticulous and ruthless precision. To neutralize Allied air superiority and electronic eavesdropping, a strict radio silence was imposed on all participating units. Orders were transmitted in person by dispatch riders, a throwback to an earlier era of warfare, ensuring that no stray radio signals could be intercepted. The massive redeployment of troops and equipment was a ghost-like migration conducted entirely under the cover of darkness and the notoriously foul Ardennes weather. During the day, divisions remained hidden in the dense forests, camouflaged from reconnaissance planes, their movements frozen. Only when night fell did the long columns of tanks, trucks, and soldiers resume their slow, cautious advance toward the front lines. The level of security was draconian. Roads were closed to civilian traffic, and any soldier found moving in an unauthorized area was at risk of being shot without question. This operational secrecy was reinforced by an atmosphere of extreme personal peril for anyone involved in the planning. In a measure of the operation's critical importance and Hitler's paranoia, every officer with knowledge of Wacht am Rhein was compelled to sign a personal oath, a formal document binding them to absolute silence. This was no mere formality. The document explicitly stated that any breach, intentional or accidental, would be treated as high treason, punishable by immediate execution. The psychological weight of this threat was immense, ensuring that the secret was held tightly within a very small circle of command, far from the prying ears of Allied intelligence networks. Compounding the effectiveness of these measures was a fatal complacency within the Allied intelligence community. By the winter of 1944, a prevailing groupthink had settled over most Allied headquarters. The consensus was that the Wehrmacht was a spent force, bled white on the Eastern Front and incapable of launching anything more than localized counterattacks. Intelligence reports that hinted at German troop concentrations were dismissed as preparations for a defensive campaign to counter General Patton's expected thrust into the Saar. This confirmation bias led analysts to interpret all evidence through the lens of their preconceived notions. According to a persistent rumor, this Allied mindset was actively exploited by German intelligence, which allegedly spread carefully crafted disinformation about the construction of new defensive positions in the East, deliberately drawing attention away from the silent buildup in the West. The ruse was overwhelmingly successful. The Allies were looking in the wrong direction, lulled into a false sense of security, and utterly blind to the armored fist being formed just miles from their thinly held lines. This combination of German discipline and Allied overconfidence set the stage for a devastating surprise. The dawn of December 16, 1944, arrived not with light, but with a sudden, violent eruption of fire and sound that tore the morning tranquility to shreds. At 5:30 a.m., along a quiet, snow-covered front, thousands of German artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire in a coordinated, deafening chorus. For the unsuspecting American soldiers huddled in their dugouts and foxholes, the world was transformed into a maelstrom of chaos and terror in an instant. The German offensive began with this massive artillery strike, a meticulously planned barrage that targeted a poorly fortified and thinly manned 80-kilometer stretch of the front. American GIs, jolted from their sleep, stumbled out into the frigid air, struggling to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe unfolding around them as shells rained down upon their positions. Compounding the shock and confusion was the weather. The first critical hours of the assault took place under the cover of a thick, impenetrable fog that clung to the hills and forests of the Ardennes. This dense fog, which had for days grounded the formidable Allied air forces, now served as the perfect cloak for the German advance. Shielded from view, columns of German tanks and waves of infantry moved forward, their silhouettes rendered ghostly and indistinct by the mist. The weather effectively blinded the American defenders, turning the battle into a series of terrifyingly close-quarters encounters where enemy soldiers would suddenly emerge from the gray shroud only yards away. For the German attackers, the fog was an invaluable ally, allowing them to bypass strongpoints and penetrate deep into the American lines before their presence was even fully registered. The effect on the American forward positions was immediate and devastating. The combination of the overwhelming bombardment and the surprise ground assault shattered the front lines. In the first few hours of the attack, some American units were completely annihilated, their positions overrun before they had a chance to mount an organized defense. Entire companies were cut off, surrounded, and forced to surrender, their communications severed and their command structures obliterated. The ferocity of the assault created pockets of chaos and desperation all along the line, as isolated groups of soldiers fought bravely against an enemy they could barely see, an enemy whose sheer numbers seemed impossible. So profound was the element of surprise that it distorted the initial perception of the battle at higher command levels. The reports that trickled back from the front were fragmented, frantic, and often contradictory, painting a picture of localized but severe disruptions. Many American commanders, far removed from the brutal reality of the front line, could not conceive that the German army, which they believed to be on its last legs, could mount an offensive of this magnitude. As a result, they initially and tragically misinterpreted the event. What was in fact the beginning of Hitler's last great gamble was widely dismissed as a localized counterattack, a spoiling action designed to disrupt Allied plans, but nothing more. This fundamental misunderstanding of the situation would cost the Allies precious hours, allowing the German storm to surge deeper into the Ardennes before its true and terrifying scope was finally understood. As the German tide surged westward through the Ardennes, shattering the American front line, the initial chaos began to coalesce around a single, strategic focal point, the small, unassuming Belgian market town of Bastogne. On a map, it was just another town, but in the context of a blitzkrieg-style armored offensive, it was the absolute key to the entire operation. Bastogne's importance did not lie in its size or its industry, but in its geography. It was a critical transportation hub, a nexus from which 7 of the region's main paved roads radiated outwards like the spokes of a wheel. For the German panzer divisions, these roads were the arteries of their advance. To maintain the speed and momentum required to reach the Meuse River and then Antwerp, they needed these all-weather routes. Without control of Bastogne, their formidable tank columns risked being funneled into narrow, winding, and snow-choked secondary roads, where they would inevitably bog down, burn precious fuel, and become easy targets. The race to control Bastogne had become the race to determine the fate of the entire German offensive. Realizing the town's emergent strategic value, the Allied High Command made a desperate move. They activated their most reliable strategic reserve, the battle-hardened 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The division, resting in France after the brutal fighting in Holland during Operation Market Garden, was hastily ordered to the front. There was no time for careful planning or proper outfitting. In an emergency deployment, the paratroopers were loaded onto a vast convoy of trucks and rushed northeastward in a frantic, non-stop journey toward the unfolding crisis. They traveled with only the equipment they had on hand, critically lacking sufficient winter gear, heavy artillery, and even adequate ammunition for a prolonged fight. They were a fire brigade being thrown at a forest fire, a stopgap measure to hold a vital crossroads at all costs. Upon their arrival, the men of the 101st found a town rapidly filling with the human debris of a retreating army. Bastogne was not empty, it had become a collection point for scattered and fragmented American units that had been battered and broken in the initial German onslaught. Alongside the paratroopers were disparate elements of armored divisions, leaderless groups of artillerymen who had lost their guns, and combat engineers desperately preparing demolitions. This motley collection of soldiers, from different commands and with varying degrees of combat readiness, would have to be forged into a cohesive defensive force under the leadership of the 101st. In a decision that would later be recognized as a fatal strategic error, the German command initially underestimated the imperative of capturing Bastogne swiftly. Driven by a rigid timetable and focused on the grand prize of Antwerp, the armored spearheads of the 5th Panzer Army chose not to engage in a costly, time-consuming fight for the town. Instead, they opted to bypass it, flowing around the growing pocket of American resistance, confident that it could be easily encircled and neutralized by follow-on infantry forces. They believed the American defenders were a disorganized rabble who would quickly collapse. This miscalculation, however, would leave a formidable and defiant stronghold directly astride their main supply lines, a bone in the throat of their offensive that would soon choke the life out of their last great gamble. By December 21st, the German ring of steel had slammed shut. Bastogne was completely surrounded, and its defenders were utterly cut off from all avenues of supply and reinforcement. The initial chaos of the German breakthrough had now given way to the grim, grinding reality of a siege. Inside the perimeter, an atmosphere of desperation began to take hold as the beleaguered Americans faced a two-front war, one against the enemy pressing in from all sides, and another against the brutal Ardennes winter. Hope, it seemed, was beginning to freeze and melt away under the relentless pressure. The conditions inside the town were appalling. The snow-covered streets of Bastogne became a landscape of grim survival, scarred by shell craters and littered with the debris of constant combat. For the wounded, there was little relief. Lacking a proper hospital, they were cared for in the cold, damp cellars of civilian homes, laid out on straw with a critical shortage of medicine, plasma, and bandages. The suffering was magnified by the piercing cold. Most of the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne had been rushed to the front in their standard-issue summer jackets, completely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers shivered violently in their foxholes, their hands and feet numb, fighting off frostbite as much as the Germans. To conserve what little they had, food rations were cut to a bare minimum, leaving the men weak with hunger as they endured the constant strain of combat. The shortages were acute and affected every aspect of the defense. a particularly critical scarcity was felt by the artillerymen, who watched their ammunition stockpiles dwindle to almost nothing. With no resupply possible, every shell was precious. Gunners received strict orders to fire only on guaranteed, high-value targets, forcing them to hold their fire against all but the most immediate and threatening German assaults. This rationing of firepower meant that American infantrymen often had to repel attacks with only their rifles and machine guns, facing down German tanks without the artillery support they desperately needed. Adding to their isolation was a cruel and relentless adversary, the weather itself. A thick, persistent fog and a low, oppressive cloud ceiling clung to the Ardennes, grounding the entire Allied air force. This blanket of gray effectively robbed the defenders of their lifeline. There could be no C-47 transport planes dropping desperately needed supplies, no fighter bombers to strike German artillery positions, and no reconnaissance flights to provide intelligence on enemy movements. The men of Bastogne were truly alone, trapped under a sky that offered no help. On the other side of the line, the Germans looked upon the besieged town with growing confidence. Among the German soldiers, rumors began to circulate that the trapped Americans were on the brink of collapse, their morale shattered by the cold, hunger, and relentless shelling. They believed the defenders were simply waiting for a formal offer to lay down their arms. The dual misery of their predicament was perfectly captured by one of Bastogne's defenders, who later recalled, "We didn't know what was worse, the German shells or the Ardennes frost." On the morning of December 22, as the siege entered its fourth day, the German command decided the time had come to formalize what they saw as the inevitable. A small party of 4 German soldiers, 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, emerged from the fog-shrouded woods, marching under the universally recognized protection of a large white flag. They cautiously approached the American lines, their purpose not to fight, but to parley. Their mission was to deliver a formal, written demand for the surrender of the American forces trapped in Bastogne, an ultimatum they believed would be received by a broken and demoralized command ready to accept any terms to avoid annihilation. The official document was a classic example of military psychological warfare, blending a veneer of civility with a stark and ominous threat. It was signed by General Lieutenant Heinrich von Luttwitz, the commander of the XLVII Panzer Corps, the German force primarily responsible for the encirclement of Bastogne. The ultimatum presented surrender not as a defeat, but as a logical and honorable choice. It appealed to the American commander's sense of reason and responsibility to his men, framing the situation in the grimmest of terms. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation, the message read, that is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. It went on to warn of the massive artillery concentration prepared to level Bastogne and inflict heavy civilian casualties should the offer be refused. As the German parliamentarians were escorted behind American lines to deliver their message, they observed their surroundings with professional curiosity. They had fully expected to find clear signs of panic and impending collapse, disorganization, fear in the eyes of the soldiers, and the general chaos of a command structure on the verge of disintegration. Instead, they were reportedly surprised by the relatively calm and orderly atmosphere they witnessed. The American GIs they passed seemed weary and cold, but not broken. There was a sense of grim purpose, not of the widespread demoralization the German command had assumed was rampant within the besieged pocket. This German assumption, however, was not a bluff, it was a genuine belief. From their perspective, the American position was utterly hopeless. Cut off, outnumbered, pounded by artillery, and with no hope of aerial support or resupply due to the weather, the defenders of Bastogne appeared to have no viable military options left. The German leadership truly believed that the American commander, when faced with the cold logic of his situation and the promise of total annihilation, would have no choice but to capitulate. The ultimatum was seen not merely as a threat, but as the final, necessary formality before the town's inevitable fall. They were not just demanding a surrender, they were confidently anticipating one. The German ultimatum made its way through the chain of command until it was placed in the hands of the acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. In his makeshift, chilly headquarters in a Bastogne cellar, McAuliffe read the lengthy German proposal demanding his surrender. The document, with its blend of formal military courtesy and dire threats of total annihilation, did not have the intended effect. Instead of inspiring fear or sober reflection, it was met with disbelief and derision. Upon finishing it, McAuliffe is said to have let out a short, incredulous laugh and uttered a single, dismissive word that would soon echo through the annals of military history: nuts. Initially, McAuliffe had no intention of dignifying the German demand with a formal reply. He crumpled the paper and tossed it aside, considering the matter closed. However, his staff officers convinced him otherwise. They argued that military protocol, and indeed the morale of their own men, required some form of official response to be sent back to the German commander. A simple silence could be misinterpreted as weakness or indecision. Agreeing, McAuliffe pondered what to write. When his staff struggled to formulate a suitably defiant but formal reply, he decided to stick with his initial, gut reaction. The best response, he concluded, was the one that came to him naturally. The task of delivering this unconventional message fell to Colonel Joseph Harper. To ensure there was no misunderstanding, he had the official reply typed out on a sheet of paper. It was a model of brevity, a stark and unambiguous rejection that contained none of the diplomatic flourishes of the German original. It read simply, "To the German commander, nuts." The American commander. Harper himself then carried this message back to the waiting and expectant German parliamentarians. The Germans were utterly baffled by the American reply. The colloquialism was entirely lost on them, and they stared at the paper, confused by the strange, single-word response. "What does this mean?" they asked. Colonel Harper, displaying the same blunt spirit as his commander, provided a clear and immediate translation. "It means, go to hell," he explained. The anecdote of the Germans' confusion and Harper's crude clarification would become a treasured part of the legend. News of their commander's reply spread like wildfire throughout the American positions in Bastogne. For the cold, hungry, and exhausted soldiers shivering in their foxholes, the story was an electrifying jolt of morale. In a moment, the single word, nuts, transformed the grim reality of their situation. It was audacious, funny, and profoundly American in its defiance. It gave the men a rallying cry, a symbol of their collective refusal to yield. The response instantly lifted their spirits, reinforcing their resolve and turning their desperate defense into a point of immense pride. Years later, McAuliffe himself would reflect on the moment with humility. "I didn't think it would become anything special," he remarked. "Just the first word that came to mind." But for the men holding the line in Bastogne, that one word was everything. It was a concise and powerful expression of the American spirit, a symbol of unwavering fortitude and the refusal to surrender, even when trapped in the most hopeless of situations. When the German parliamentarians returned with the American response, the initial reaction at the German headquarters was one of sheer disbelief. The commanders who had so confidently predicted a swift and logical surrender were utterly shocked by the reply. Nuts. The word was alien, dismissive, and profoundly insulting. It was not the response of a demoralized and beaten force on the verge of annihilation, it was the reply of an enemy filled with inexplicable and infuriating defiance. The German generals had misjudged their opponent completely. They had expected to find a commander weakened by fear and isolation, but instead, they had encountered an unyielding and insolent will that flew in the face of all military logic. This shocking rejection immediately ignited a series of fierce and contentious arguments within the German command. The unexpected American fortitude had created a serious strategic dilemma, and there was no consensus on how to proceed. One faction of officers, incensed by the American audacity, argued for an immediate and overwhelming assault. They insisted that Bastogne must be completely destroyed, its defenders annihilated to the last man as an example. For them, it had become a matter of honor and a need to crush this pocket of resistance that was mocking their military power. Another, more pragmatic group, argued that such a course would be a disastrous mistake. They contended that the primary objective was still the port of Antwerp and that the offensive was already falling behind its strict timetable. To divert elite panzer divisions and precious artillery resources for a bloody, time-consuming siege of a strategically bypassed town would be to play directly into the Allies' hands. They urged their superiors to continue the advance, leaving the containment of Bastogne to second-tier infantry units. The psychological impact of the reply began to trickle down from the high command to the frontline soldiers. According to persistent rumors from the period, when German troops learned of the Americans' defiant one-word answer, it planted a seed of doubt in their minds. They had been told that the encircled Americans were trapped and hopeless, on the verge of starvation and freezing to death. Yet, the brazen confidence of the nuts reply suggested something else entirely. It hinted at a reserve of strength and morale that contradicted the official narrative, causing some to question whether the defenders of Bastogne were truly in as desperate a position as they had been led to believe. Ultimately, the American reply became a significant psychological turning point in the battle. The unwavering German confidence in a quick and inevitable capitulation of Bastogne was shattered. The nuts response did more than just boost American morale, it sowed discord and uncertainty among their attackers. The offensive's critical forward momentum, which relied on speed and the enemy's psychological collapse, was tangibly slowed. The Germans had lost their sureness, their forward impulse blunted not only by enemy fire but by the sudden, unnerving realization that the will of the men they had surrounded was not going to break. The defiant nuts was not just a message, it was a challenge thrown at the feet of the German command. Their response was swift, predictable, and ferocious. Having been met with insolence where they expected submission, the Germans unleashed their full fury upon Bastogne. The days following the ultimatum saw a dramatic intensification of attacks. Fresh infantry units and powerful panzer divisions were thrown against the American perimeter in a determined effort to crush the pocket of resistance and make the defenders pay for their commander's audacity. The Americans had made their stand in words, now they would have to back it up with blood and deeds. Inside the besieged town, the conditions grew more desperate with each passing hour. The defense was a study in grim conservation and unwavering resolve. American artillerymen, their ammunition stocks critically low, were forced to count every single shell, firing only when a target was confirmed and the potential for maximum damage was guaranteed. Infantrymen in their frozen foxholes carefully conserved their bullets, making every shot count as they repelled wave after wave of German assaults. In the cold cellars that served as makeshift aid stations, the wounded lay on beds of straw, their suffering a constant, quiet reminder of the siege's human cost. Yet, despite the hunger, the bitter cold, and the relentless enemy pressure, no one spoke of capitulation. The single word, nuts, had solidified their will to fight to the very end. This remarkable steadfastness was not born of brute force, but of intelligent tactics and incredible adaptability. American officers organized a compact, all-round defense, creating a tight perimeter that could shift resources to meet threats from any direction. They coordinated their scarce artillery with lethal efficiency, ensuring that every precious shell was used to its greatest effect. The very structure of the defending force was a testament to their ingenuity. The defenders of Bastogne created improvised fighting groups, blending the battle-hardened paratroopers of the 101st with the scattered remnants of the other battered units that had been caught in the town. This fusion of disparate soldiers forged a unique and powerful system of mutual support, where men from different divisions fought side by side as a single, cohesive unit. In essence, the refusal to surrender had fundamentally transformed the nature of the battle for every man holding the line. What had begun as a desperate military necessity, to hold a strategic crossroads and delay the German advance, had now become something far more profound. It was now a matter of honor and of principle. The defense of Bastogne was no longer just about a town on a map, it was about validating their commander's famous reply and proving to the world, and to themselves, that their defiance was not an empty gesture. For a week, the skies over Bastogne had been a solid, oppressive ceiling of gray. The persistent fog and low clouds had been the Germans' greatest ally, grounding the Allied air power that could have turned the tide of the siege. But on the morning of December 23, something miraculous happened. As the weary defenders peered out from their foxholes, they witnessed a dramatic shift in the heavens. The dense clouds began to thin and part, and for the first time in days, patches of blue sky appeared. A weak winter sun broke through, glinting off the snow-covered landscape. This was the moment the besieged garrison had been praying for, a turning point that arrived like a Christmas miracle. The change in weather triggered an immediate and massive response from the Allied command. As soon as the skies were clear enough for flight, a vast armada of American aircraft was unleashed. The sight was breathtaking for the men on the ground. The sky, which for so long had been empty and silent, was suddenly filled with the roar of engines as hundreds of C-47 transport planes appeared overhead. It was the lifeline they had almost lost hope of seeing. Soon, the air was filled with parachutes of every color, blossoming against the blue sky as they drifted down, carrying the lifeblood of the defense. In a massive, coordinated aerial operation, the planes dropped thousands of containers filled with everything the garrison desperately needed: ammunition for the starved artillery batteries, medical supplies for the wounded, and care rations for the hungry soldiers. The airdrop was not without its own dangers and desperate struggles. The perimeter around Bastogne was tight, and the pilots had to fly low and steady through German anti-aircraft fire to ensure accuracy. Inevitably, some of the precious cargo went astray. A number of parachutes drifted off course and fell directly into German-held territory, landing behind enemy lines. This led to a series of frantic and fierce skirmishes on the ground, as both sides scrambled to recover the valuable containers. Small patrols of American soldiers dashed out from their defensive positions to retrieve the desperately needed supplies, often engaging in brutal, close-quarters fights with German troops who were equally determined to seize the bounty for themselves. Despite these challenges, the effect of the airlift on the defenders' morale was immediate and profound. It was a tangible, visible sign that they were no longer alone. The sight of the American planes dominating the sky was an affirmation that the vast power of the Allied war machine was finally coming to their aid. As one defender famously put it, encapsulating the feeling of the entire garrison, "When we saw our planes, we knew we would hold out." The Allied aircraft did more than just deliver supplies. With the skies now clear, American fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, were unleashed upon the German forces encircling the town. For days, the German artillery and tank positions had operated with impunity, hidden by the fog. Now, they were exposed and vulnerable. The planes began a relentless series of devastating bombing and strafing runs, pounding German positions around Bastogne with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. The balance of power in the siege had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. The weather had broken in the Allies' favor, and with it, the German army's last great advantage in the battle for Bastogne was lost. The final, dramatic chapter of the Siege of Bastogne was written not by the defenders within, but by the relentless armored columns of General George S. Patton's Third Army. On December 26, 1944, after 6 grueling days of encirclement, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through the German lines and established a corridor to the besieged town. The siege was broken. This relief was the culmination of one of the most remarkable military maneuvers of the war. In a feat of logistical and tactical brilliance, Patton had executed a breathtaking pivot, turning his entire army a full 90 degrees from its previous eastward advance and sending it north. In a desperate race against time, his soldiers and tanks had battled their way over more than 100 kilometers of icy, snow-clogged roads in just a few days to reach their beleaguered comrades. Inside Bastogne, the arrival of Patton's forces was met with a complex mix of relief and fierce pride. For years after the battle, a good-natured debate would persist among the veterans over whether the 101st Airborne had actually been rescued. Steeped in their own heroic resistance, many of the paratroopers proudly insisted that they could have held out indefinitely and were perfectly capable of handling the situation themselves. This sentiment was immortalized in a now famous, if perhaps apocryphal, anecdote. As the first of Patton's tanks rumbled into the American perimeter, one of its officers supposedly greeted a paratrooper from the 101st with a cheerful, "Glad to see you guys." The paratrooper, embodying the defiant spirit of his division, allegedly quipped back, "Were you fellows looking for help? We never asked for any." Anecdotes aside, the strategic importance of the defense was undeniable. The epic stand at Bastogne had achieved something far greater than simply holding a town. By refusing to surrender, the defenders had forced the Germans to divert crucial armored units and commit to a costly siege. This defiant bottleneck fatally delayed the German offensive for several critical, irreplaceable days. That delay was the gift of time the Allied command desperately needed. It allowed them to rush reinforcements to the front, stabilize the lines, and begin organizing the powerful counteroffensive that would ultimately crush the German Bulge. The lifting of the siege marked the definitive turning point in the entire Ardennes offensive. With Bastogne held and the relief corridor opened, the German army's last great gamble was doomed. Their spearheads were overextended, their supply lines were now harassed from a secure Allied stronghold in their rear, and the element of surprise was long gone. From that moment on, the tide of the battle had irrevocably turned. The strategic initiative had decisively and finally shifted from the attackers to the Allies, who now began the slow, bloody work of pushing the Germans back to the Rhine. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final, desperate gamble in the West, ended in a catastrophic and unequivocal failure for the German army. The ambitious objectives were never met, the Meuse River was never crossed, and the grand prize of Antwerp remained firmly in Allied hands. The operation bled the Wehrmacht of its last strategic reserves, its final panzer divisions, its remaining experienced soldiers, and its dwindling supplies of fuel and equipment. After the Battle of the Bulge, the German war machine in the West was broken beyond repair, capable only of a fighting retreat back to the borders of the Reich. The high confidence of the German generals, so certain that their meticulously planned surprise attack would shatter the Allied front, was ultimately wrecked on the frozen, shell-torn earth of Bastogne. Their belief in a swift victory, predicated on speed and the enemy's psychological collapse, met an immovable object in the form of ordinary American soldiers who, when faced with a hopeless situation, simply refused to surrender. The defiance of the 101st Airborne and the other defenders became a microcosm of the entire battle, proving that the will to resist could be a more powerful strategic asset than any number of tanks or guns. In the center of this legendary stand is the single word that defined it. General McAuliffe's reply, "nuts," transcended its immediate context to become one of the most famous and cherished utterances in American military history. It became a powerful and enduring symbol of the American fighting spirit, blunt, defiant, and unyielding in the face of overwhelming odds. It perfectly encapsulated the nation's refusal to be intimidated and its unwavering resolve when pushed into a corner. The man who spoke the word, however, always remained humble about his role in the legend. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe was later promoted and celebrated as a national hero for his leadership during the siege. Yet, he consistently deflected the praise, insisting that the true heroes of Bastogne were the men in the foxholes, the cold, hungry, and exhausted GIs who held the line day after day. He believed he had merely given voice to the sentiment that was already in every soldier's heart. This conviction was perfectly expressed in his Christmas message to his troops, issued in the darkest days of the siege: "They have asked us to surrender. We have answered them as all American soldiers who have been cornered would answer." Years later, long after the snows of that terrible winter had melted and the sounds of battle had faded into memory, the veterans of Bastogne would gather. In their reunions, they would recall the biting Ardennes frost, the constant shelling, and the gnawing hunger. And they would remember with pride that pivotal moment in a cold December, when their commander's single, defiant word gave them the strength to change the course of the greatest battle on the Western Front.